mention concerning Sister Sue Green. That visitation tomorrow will be at Berry Hill from 11 to 1 p.m. And then, of course, the funeral service will be at 1 o'clock. So please do remember that family in your prayers. And if you had any personal remembrance of her, I would appreciate that information if you would share it with me after our service is over with. We've been studying on Wednesday night 1 Thessalonians, and a couple of weeks ago we were not finished with the study. We got finished, but we didn't have time to look at this material, and I thought it was so very important and so helpful that I wanted us to look at this in a little more depth today. Do remember that our evening service, our midweek service this week will be Tuesday night, not Wednesday, as the elders have done for many years, having our service this coming Tuesday at 6 o'clock so that you can have your Wednesday to be with family or getting ready for family. Keep that in mind. Also, Tuesday, we will not have our Pioneer class as well. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, Paul is dealing with the matter of sanctification. A fancy word that basically means being set apart for a purpose. And what Paul is referring to here in the context, 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verses 1 through verse 8, is that they were to keep themselves as Christians pure and set apart. And it'd be well and good for us to say, okay, that makes sense. Paul is saying as Christians, you're to be different. But then specifically, he gives us three particular avenues in which we must be extremely set apart and different. For example, he says, you as Christians are to have nothing to do with sexual immorality. And we talked about that in our Wednesday night study a couple of Wednesday nights ago. As a child of God, regardless of how much the world screams and yells and hollers that there is no good, there is nothing wrong, there's nothing impure about anything that one wants to do with their body in any kind of way, the Bible says continually that sexual immorality of any kind is sinful. Secondly, he mentions that you've got to control yourself, particularly with this passion of lust, that, again, as a child of God, because you've been set apart, you've got to avoid just doing what you feel or doing what the world feels like. And then thirdly, he mentions within the context of that passage, that's the way you act toward others around you. You do not in any way involve them with sexual immorality, either with someone connected to that situation or anyone in regard to the influence that one's involved with. So it's with that in mind, verses 1 through 8, that Paul deals with another subject. And it's one that I think sometimes we forget about. Personal responsibility. Now, what in the world does the Bible say about personal responsibility? And secondly, why would Paul deal with that subject here with a, as it were, very immature, babe-type church of Thessalonica? And I think the answer would have to be, if you can't take care of yourself, and if you're not willing to take care of yourself, then you become a burden to somebody. You know, in a family situation, we may sometimes know of someone in the family. It may not be your children. It may not be even your grandchildren. Maybe it's just a relative on down the line that throughout their life, they've been a burden to others. Now, there may have been physical reasons. There may have been mental reasons. There may have been handicap issues, or it could have been that they just were the kind of people that did not want to take care of themselves. You may know of someone like that. And here's Paul writing to a church, a very young church, spiritually speaking. And he says the first thing that you've got to do when it comes to personal responsibility is to take care and love one another. And in what was read a moment ago by Kurt, verse 9 says, you love one another because you've learned and been taught by God to love one another. I wish I knew all that meant. Likely he's referencing the point that God is love, as so many times the New Testament says, and even the Old Testament says. And it's for that reason then that if God loves you, then you have the right and you certainly have the example to love each other. But then in verse 10, he says, not only are you to love one another as you have been doing, but when you think that you've done all that you need to do, love some more. Think about it. Moms, dads, grandparents, do you ever get enough hugs from your kids or your grandkids? Probably not. Do you ever get enough attention? I'm talking about the right kind of attention, positive, loving, wonderful attention. And do you ever finally say, okay, that's enough? Probably most of us never do that. I'm reminded Marshall Keeble used to take some of his younger Bible students with him when they would go to a gospel meeting, and they would preach a couple of minutes before he preached, and then he preached the main lesson. Well, one of those preacher boys grew up. And after a few years of working with his own congregation, he called Brother Keeble one day, and he said, Brother Keeble, I said, I got a problem with the cistern. He said, you got a problem with the cistern? What's going on, young man? He said, well, they're always hugging on me. He said, what do I do? And Brother Keeble said, do exactly what I do, stand still till they're through. Well, you know, there's something to be said for that, not just as a preacher, particularly as an older preacher to someone, but particularly when it comes to the idea of our love and our relationships to each other. You know, we're supposed to love, and we're supposed to love some more. Mike, I appreciate that. But that's what Paul is saying there in verse 10. You know, when you think that you've done all that you need to do, you know, do this more and more. Which I think seems to suggest that there's never a time that we come in contact with someone that we say, okay, that's enough. You know, I've given them too much love. That's probably not the case. Because they probably need attention. They likely need a hug. They likely need a pat on the back. They likely need an encouraging word. But then he connects that love to verse 11 when he says that you love more and more, and then he says, verse 11, and to aspire to live quietly. To aspire to live quietly. I looked up my Charles B. Williams translation, and that's no kin to me. It's a Greek scholar back in 1928 that was said to be one of the greatest Greek linguists of that day. And he did his own translation of the Bible. And I love to see, particularly from the verb forms, of how you translate that. And this is what he said that particular verse means, or phrase means. Keep up your ambition to live quietly. Keep up your ambition to live quietly. Philip's translation, study to be quiet. And you're thinking, well, first of all, how do you study? How do you become ambitious to live a quiet life? And secondly, why would you do that? Well, think about that. A lot of times when you think about someone that you consider to be wise and intelligent beyond their years, they're not the kind of people that are just talking constantly, are they? And secondly, when you talk to them about something that you want an answer from or you want their opinion about, they typically think before they say something. Could it be that Paul is saying here, if you want to love more and more, if you want to set yourself apart from God and be a person that will be useful and helpful to other individuals, make it your aim, make it your goal to be quiet. One commentator said that an ambitious life is not a quiet life. And what he was referring to from the original language, it seems like that Paul was saying, look, if you're constantly in constant motion, if you're always just running from here, there, and yonder, and you're trying to get out that almighty dream of what we call success, you're not going to be quiet about it because you're going to cause a lot of commotion. And Paul is saying, do just the opposite. Make it your goal, make it your ambition to be quiet. And then Paul turns to yet another phrase. And I know I translated it, mind your own business. That's what the New King James says about that next phrase. They're found in verse 11. The English Standard Version says to mind your own affairs. And again, before we look at that point, let's ask the question, what would that do? Could it be that Paul was saying, if you want to make it your aim, your goal, to live quietly, to live devotedly, to think about, to ponder as to what success is, and then go about doing it, the very best way to do so is to take care of yourself first in regard to the need and the attention that you need to give. There was a couple down in South Alabama years ago, and this is not in any disrespect to the female that I'm going to reference here. He was a very quiet man. He said very few words when it came to conversation. Now, when you were talking to them, he would talk. But in a public kind of way, he was very, very quiet. She was just the opposite. And so they were celebrating their 50th anniversary. And we were having some fun concerning the different ones that have been celebrating 50 years together. And I made the comment about this particular couple. I said, I asked his name, I mentioned his name, I asked him, what is the secret to 50 years of marriage together? And he said very quickly, I don't mind her business and I don't mind mine either. Well, I'm afraid today that there are a lot of folks that try to mind other people's business to not only their demise, but also to your own demise as well. Why should we, in the context of what Paul is here dealing with, why should Paul say, through inspiration of the Spirit, love one another, love even more so than you think you ought to, work out, make it your ambition, your goal to live a quiet life, and by the way, take care of your own affairs? I thought about that. Could it not be that Paul was saying, because nobody else can do it better than you can? But secondly, because if you do it quite well, that'll take up most of your time. Now think about that. Most of us, from time to time, in our imperfect kind of way, mess up enough that it's going to take us a lot of time to take care of that mess ups that we've done in our life, rather than to let somebody else handle it, which is not their problem in the first place. Thirdly, it's because it's your responsibility to do so. Galatians chapter 6, Paul's already dealt with verse 1 and 2. Go out and bear the burdens of others and see to someone that's in need, spiritually speaking, and you consider yourself lest you also be tempted. But then he said in verse 5, for each will have to bear his own load. And what Paul was saying there is, when it comes to accountability, particularly personal responsibility, nobody is more responsible than you are to your needs. And I wish we understand that in our world today, particularly in our society. First and foremost, it's not the United States government, or it's not the state of Alabama, or it's not DHR or anybody else that's responsible for me and for my children and even my grandchildren before me. It's my responsibility. And I know that there are situations and circumstances in which those entities have to get involved. But each will bear his own load. And then there's one more reason that we don't even like to think about, but it's biblical in nature, so therefore I bring it up. Why should we mind our own affairs, our own business? Because nobody likes a busybody. That's why. In 2 Thessalonians, in reference to this idea of the problems of the church there at Thessalonica, evidently some of these people had succumbed that because Jesus was coming immediately, they decided to quit their jobs and just sort of wait on the Lord, where they were becoming a nuisance to others. And besides that, and because they didn't have a job to take care of their financial needs, guess what was happening? They were needing handouts from the church. And so in the context of that passage, Paul says in verse 11, if anyone is not willing to work, let him not eat, for we hear that some among you walk in idleness, not busy at work, but busybodies. In other words, they were becoming a nuisance to the church or anybody else that they were around. You turn a couple of pages over to 1 Timothy chapter 5, and Paul, in reference to widows, particularly of a certain age, those who are younger widows, he says this concerning them in verse 13. Besides that, they learn to be idlers, but also gossips and busybodies, saying what they should not. So in other words, because their husbands had died early on in life and these young widows had time on their hand and nothing else evidently to do, they were going from place to place, from house to house, and from church to church, causing problems. And Paul said those things ought not be. Mind your own business. Wouldn't the world be better today if everybody minded their own business? And again, I realize that there are some extenuating circumstances where that may not be the case, how that sometimes could not be the case. But here's Paul writing through inspiration to a church that's immature and young and growing, and Paul says these words. But then notice the next phrase. He says here, not only to mind your own affairs and to work with your hands as we instructed you. Notice here, Paul says that this phrase work, or this commandment for them to work, was not a suggestion. I can't think of a scripture in the Bible that would seem to suggest that a person that is able-bodied and able-minded should not work honorably and honestly to take care of themselves and others. First of all, we work because we can provide for our own family. In the context, again, 1 Timothy chapter 5 and verse 8, as Paul is dealing with, again, widows in those situations, particularly the first century, he reminds us that those who do not take care of themselves, those who do not provide for their own family, have denied the faith, and then he says they are worse than an infidel. They're worse than an unbeliever. Interesting phrase. And what was Paul's point? You've got a responsibility within your family to take care of your family. And again, the context deals with the idea of in-laws and sons and daughters and other people taking care of their widowed mom. But the principle, I think, is also still very true. That when it comes to the idea of our working, one of our aims, one of our God-given responsibilities is for us to take care of our own. But also notice, it has an effect on the outsider. Look at the context of the passage of 1 Thessalonians 4. And to work with your own hands as we instructed you, so that you may walk properly before outsiders. Paul, what are you saying? I'm saying that when it comes to your working, you as a Christian have a direct influence on people outside the church that see you work, that see you operating in an honest kind of way, that you providing for your family. That's what he's saying there. But by your working, you're influencing others for good because they know and see, hey, here's a Christian that is working, that is taking care of his responsibility and do it in a good way. And then, of course, as the verse also says, that you be dependent on no one. Now again, we sometimes get into situations where there's a need, a temporary need for someone to be taken care of. But to this church at Thessalonica, even before he addresses this issue of this second coming of Christ and what some of them were doing, here's Paul saying, look, work, it's not just a suggestion. Work honorably, work honestly, work with your own hands. Take care of the needs of your family. Influence the outsiders around you who see that and know that you're doing that. But then the final answer, the final reason, so that you don't have to depend on anybody else. You can take care of yourself. The Greeks of the first century consider work to be a bad word, a bad four-letter word. They looked upon work as being something that slaves did. And Paul knows that. He's been among them. And also, you may recall that whenever Paul went on a missionary journey, he was working always, doing labor for himself to provide income for himself. He never wanted to be a burden on anyone. And yet sometimes people chastised him, particularly in the Corinthian letters, about him working when he ought to have been serving the Lord. And Paul was saying, I'm serving the Lord by the work that I do. William Barclay wrote this comment on this particular verse in his commentary, 1 Thessalonians, page 234. Listen to what he says. The aim of the conduct of some of the Thessalonians was that others had to support them. Paul told them that they must aim at independence and never become spongers on charity. It is the Christian's duty to help others, for many, through no fault of their own, cannot attain independence. But it is also the Christian's duty to help himself. And I think that's what Paul was trying to say here. If you want to influence others around you for good, go do an honest day's labor. Take care of your family. Provide for them, not just the spiritual training, but also the physical needs as well. Again, there are always emergencies, but the point of the matter is, it should not be the case that the very first people that someone thinks of when it comes to the idea of help is the Lord's church. It should be they take care of themselves, if at all possible, our family when they do so. Colossians chapter 4, verse 5. walk in wisdom toward outsiders, making the best use of the time. Paul, what are you trying to tell us? Sanctification, set apart. Yes, by your body. Yes, by the way you live your life. Yes, by your influence on others. But besides that, make it your aim, make it your goal to live quietly. Make it your aim and goal to be honorable. Make it your aim and goal to work. You ever thought about the life of Jesus Christ? It seems like from what we read about his biography that after likely his earthly father figure died, Joseph, Jesus went to work to provide for his mom and his half-brothers and sisters. He's called the carpenter. He's called the carpenter's son. And we don't know how many years he worked before he began his spiritual ministry of 3.5 years. But he worked because there was a need for him to work. I think the same is true for us today, particularly in the 21st century world. For all of us to be the right example of living for God by the honest work that we do. You've listened well. If you need to respond to the Lord's invitation, we invite you to come. Let's give